Hello and welcome to another episode of creating an underwater survival game like Subnautica. This is part 7. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on tool usage. Because last episode, we just finished setting up the hotbar. The first thing we're going to do in this episode is to set up a tool-based class from which the other classes can derive from. And then we're going to be setting up a couple of different tools, including a weapon as well as a deployable tool. After that, we're going to be setting up the functionality of actually using the tools. Let's jump right in. The first thing we're going to want to do is to open up the player controller. So under the interaction functions, we want to add a new function. So I'm going to open these up. And here, I'm going to add a function called current hotbar item. And what it'll do is return the current item scriptable object of the item that's being held in your hand. So we'll be using this later when calling the event. The next thing we're going to do is to fix a bug with the hotbar. I'll show you. So if you remember in the previous episode, we set the hotbar such that whenever we set it to an object and there's multiple of the same object in the inventory, you can't set it to other places even if you use a different object. But at the same time, when you remove an object from the inventory, it'll remain in your hotbar until there's no more of the objects left. So if I'm holding this item and I remove all of these, as you can see, the hotbar updates. But actually, we didn't update the items that have been spawned in for holding. So I can still select the fish, even though it doesn't exist in the inventory anymore and it's not in the hotbar anymore. So in order to fix this, you just need to make a change in the inventory system and in the hotbar slot class. So in the inventory system, I'm going to go to the hotbar functions and I'm going to go to check hotbar. So here in check hotbar, not only do we need to set the slot to be null, we also need to respawn the hotbar items. There's also another thing we need to do. If I go over to the hotbar slot class, when we go to the spawn items function, you'll see here that if the item equals none, it will actually just return. But before we do that, if the item equals none, we need to actually destroy the hotbar item before we return. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to move it up. So here it will destroy the hotbar item first, and then if it's null, it will return because we don't need any of these. Now I can start making the tool-based class. So under inventory, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it tools. Under tools, I'm going to create a new class called the tool-based class. Now I'm going to open it up. So this is going to be a mono behavior class that all of the other classes will inherit from. So in this class, I'm going to have a reference to the player controller and the inventory system. And then I'm also going to have a function called useTool, which is going to be invoked every time we use the tool that is equipped on our hotbar slot. We're also going to create an overridable function so that we can add a function to using the tool. So that whenever we inherit from this class, they can override this function and add their own unique tool usage to it. Don't worry about the static variables because we are going to assign them in the player controller class and the inventory system class because we don't want this to be reassigned every single time we have a tool in the scene. So we only want it to be assigned once rather than over and over again. So I'm going to delete start and update. I'm going to add use tool. Here I'm going to create an internal virtual function called tool functions. So this is the one that's meant to be overridden. And then over in useTool, I'm going to call tool functions. The next thing we're going to do is to add the functionality for the tools. So we go to hotbar, and then we go to hotbar slot. We're going to add a new variable to hotbar slot. And then if we go down to spawn hotbar item, here I'm going to get the tool-based class of the hotbar item and set tool to that. Next, we need to go back to player controller. So in order to implement usage of tool, we need to create a Unity event. So I'm going to call it the useTool event. So in order to do that, I have to create a new class. So I'm just going to do it right at the top of player controller because this is where we'll be calling the event from. After that, if I go down to player interaction, underneath hand, I'm going to add a use tool event. We're going to create the event here. We also need to set the tool base class static variables here. Next, I'm going to add a tool default action. So in interaction functions, I'm going to add a new function called tool default action. This is a function that will be called in case the item held doesn't have its own tool-based class and thus doesn't have any action that it can take when being held. So if you happen to equip something without a tool-based class, then it will default to this function. In future, in the tool default action, you can just put an animation of the player moving their hand forward or something like that to denote that the item is trying to be used, but there is no effect to it being used because it has no use functions. The next thing we need to do is to edit the hold item function. So here, instead of just setting the item held number, whenever we use hold item, we need to update use tool such that it has the functions of the currently held item. So how I'm going to do this is by removing all the listeners of use tool, then I'm going to put a debug log. After that, if the currently held item does not have a tool-based class, then we'll set it to the default action. But if it does have the tool-based class, we'll add a listener to use tool to use the function from the tool-based class. Lastly, we need to invoke this event. So if I go to update, I can add the event, I can add the tool usage here. Here I'm going to check if the right mouse button is clicked and if the item held is not -1, which means no item is held. And then we can check if the slot is empty, and if it isn't, we can invoke use tool. So here, whenever we right click and we are holding an item in the hotbar, we will invoke use tool. So let's see what this play out. Since none of our items currently have the tool-based class on their prefabs, we should get the default tool usage. So I'm just going to put 2 items in my inventory. As you can see, we can use them properly. And as for the fish, if I remove it from my inventory, you'll find that I can no longer select the fish anymore. And here, if I right-click this knife, and if I check my console log, it says non-tool use. And if I click it more times, still non-tool use. So that's great. The next thing we're going to do for the video is to create the weapon class. So in order to have a weapon, we need to have a health system first. So this health system will be on all creatures that have health, and this will allow them to have to keep track of what health they're at, as well as take damage or restore health. The health system will also handle the death of different animals or even the player. So let's do it. I'm going to go to player and I'm going to create a new script. So we're going to need a couple of functions, including max health and current health. For max health, I'm going to set the default to be 5. So when we start, we want to set the current health to the max health. Then we would want several functions. We would want a function to restore the health. So what we're going to do is to add the restore amount to the current health, but we have to make sure it doesn't exceed max health. So I'm going to use the mathf.minimum function. Basically what this does is it'll usually set the current health to be current health plus restore amount, but if that amount is larger than the max health, then it'll just set it to max health instead. Next, I'm going to create 2 functions. One of them is called checkDead, which checks if the animal or creature with the health is dead. And the next one is die, which is going to be a virtual function that can be overridden, which will just despawn the object. So by default, we'll just print a debug log message and also destroy the game object. If we use the health class and inherit from it,
we'll be able to override the die function and change it.
Now if I head back over to here, I'm going to create the take damage function. So this will take in a damage amount integer. So here we're just going to do current health minus equal damage amount, and then we'll check if it's dead. And then if it is dead, it will perform die. So that's all for the health system. Since we're doing the health system, we do need to update the player stats, because now health will be controlled by the health script instead of the player stat script. So how I'm going to change it is, instead of inheriting from modern behavior, I'm just going to inherit from health. So now instead of having all of the stats in the max stats in the stats lists, I'm just going to have oxygen, food, and thirst in these lists, and then health will be separate. So here I'm going to change start to awake to make sure that it's called in the correct order. So from now on, this list is only going to be only going to have 3 elements in it. So here in awake, I'll set the stat bars to max value to be max health. So now you see max health is a separate value from the list of max stats. Likewise, down in update, I'm going to also update the stat bars and stat nums with current health. So now if I go down to the Unity and I go to player, here as you can see, max health is now a separate value. I can remove the third element from max stats. So I'm going to set the health to 100, and I'm going to remove the extra element from max stats. So now the player's health should work just fine. So you can see there's still the health. We haven't implemented any ways to inflict damage on the player, but yeah, the health bar and health stats are functioning without any errors. Now I'm going to create the weapon class for tools. So if I go back to inventory and then to tools, I can create new script, and I'm going to call it weapon. So this will be used for any object that can be used as a weapon. So here we're going to inherit from tool-based class. So in the weapon class, a variable that we'll need is the amount of damage the weapon inflicts per hit. So here I can remove start and update, and I'm going to override the tool functions of tool-based class. So here is where we would want to put our code for what the weapon does. So instead of doing that directly, I'm going to create a function called attack. So for this attack function, we're going to call it whenever we call tool functions. So when we do attack, we need to check if the player controller is currently hovering any object. And then we want to check if that object has a health component. If it has a health component, then we can set the target health to be that health component, and then we can make that health component take damage. So traditionally, you would use a raycast to determine if there's anything within the weapon's line of attack. However, since we already do a raycast in player controller and we have the variable current hover object, we can just access that via the PC static variable in tool-based class and just check that instead. Now we check if the health component is null, and if it isn't, then we can command it to take damage. So that's all for the weapon-based class. Now if we want to test this out, we'll have to apply the class to a weapon. So on the penknife, I'm going to add a weapon. So I'm going to apply this to the prefab such that when it's instantiated in the player's hand, when it's held, then it will have the weapon script. I'm going to set damage to 5. One thing I neglected to do is to set the damage to be a default of 5. So I'm going to set the damage to 5, and then on one of these fish, I'm just going to add a health component. And here the max health is 5. So theoretically, if we hit this fish, it should call the die function. So I'm going to test this out. So equip this in the hotbar. And then if I target these items that don't have a health, nothing happens. But if I target this one, as you can see in the console, it actually died. So the functions are working properly. Next, I'm going to be creating the functionality for deployable items. So in Subnautica, there are some items that can be deployed. For example, the portable storage, which when deployed allows you to store items. It floats in the water, underwater, and allows you to store items. And then also fish. So whenever you hold small fish in your hands, you can actually release them back into the water. And when they are released, the AI kicks back in and they start swimming around again. So I'm going to make the functionality for that. First of all, I'm going to open up inventory system. So here we need to create a new function that allows us to deploy the items. So I'm going to go to the interacting with items region. I'm going to add the function here. So I'm going to call the function deploy item. It'll take in an item scriptable object, and what it'll do is basically the same as our move item function when it is moved from the inventory into the world space. And yeah, it will remove the item from the inventory and then instantiate it. Then of course we have to check the hotbar and then return. Now I can go under tools and I can create the deployable script. So here we'll inherit from tool-based class, and then I'll override the tool functions and I'll do deploy item. So I'm going to call deploy item. I'm going to deploy the current hotbar item from the PC. So throw back to the beginning of this video when we made the function current hotbar item to return the item that was currently being held. So we're going to use it here to get the item for the deploy item function. That's everything for the deployable class. Now if I go to small fish, if I go to this particular small fish, I can add the health script and make sure it's added to the prefab so that all the small fish have health now. And then I can drag in the deployable script here. And I'll also apply this to the prefab. So when I click play, as you can see, there's a single fish in my inventory. I can put this fish on my hotbar and then select it, and then I can throw it out onto the floor. And likewise, I can pick up these fish over here, and if I put it on a slot on my hotbar, I can deploy it, and now you see there's two more fish in my inventory. And then if I deploy the other two, now my hotbar updates and there's no more fish in my inventory either. Yeah, one more thing. Just remember to go to your project settings and your script execution order and just add in health. You want to make sure that health happens before player controller because player controller sets all the static variables of health. So I'm going to make sure it goes before and click apply. Now for the second part of the video, in Subnautica, the main weapon that you use, the knife, is not only able to deal damage to enemies, but is in fact even more commonly used to destroy some plants in order to receive cuttings from them. For example, kelp weed is not able to be picked up, but when you hit it with a knife, it will create kelp weed pieces that spawn into the inventory. And similarly, when you hit table coral with a knife, it drops table coral pieces. So let's implement this. So in the health script, we need to change the die function to be from a virtual function to be a delegate, so that whenever the health calls die, it calls the delegate instead of that overridden function. So going back to health, I'm going to add two more variables here, one of which is a delegate die action, and we'll create a die action called die. We also need to change start to awake, and then over here down in die, we're actually going to change this to default die, and we'll also change this to just a regular function. Luckily, we haven't incorporated any overriding of die, otherwise this would be a lot more annoying to change. But yeah, but now die will actually be a delegate instead of an overriding function. So here we change this to the delegate die. Then here we would want to delete update, and then over here we will want to set the die method to be default die. It makes more sense for die to be a delegate instead of a override-ridden function so that other interactable objects that don't want to inherit from health instead can just set the die. So in a future episode, we'll actually be looking at player stats, and when we create the death sequence which would respawn the player, we would actually create it in player stats, and then we would set the health die action to be that. Now if I return back to inventory, we already have interactable object, but we want to create interactable objects that instead of being picked up, will be cut such that it will drop pieces of itself. So I'm going to inherit from interactable object and create a new class. But first, I'm going to create a new folder. So in this folder, I'll put in all of the different interactable objects, including the original one. So I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to call it Cuttable Interactable Object. So Cuttable Interactable Object will inherit from interactable object because we want it to have all of the details of a regular interactable object. However, this class will actually require a health component. So this class will have a health component, and then it will change the die delegate to, instead of just destroying the object, it will spawn in the desired objects in the position that it was in. So first of all, let's create three variables. One of them would be the object you want to spawn in. Next one would be the health component of this object, and the third one would be the drop count, which would be how much of the item you would want to drop. I'm just going to set the default value to be 3. Then instead I'm going to set the health component of the object. So here I can delete update, and I'm going to create a die function. So this will be what the cuttable interactable object wants to do when it dies. So here I'm just going to have a for loop that will just spawn in the item the number of times of drop count. Then I'll destroy the game object. Then we set the health die action to be die. So back in the Unity, I'm going to go to prefabs, and then I'm going to go to items, and I'm going to open up red vine. So that I'll apply cuttable object to this. So first of all, I'm going to freeze its position and rotation because I want it to be a static plant. Then I'm going to untag it from being pickup, so now it's no longer tagged as pickup. Next, I'm going to remove the interactable object script from here, and I'm going to add a cuttable object script. So because it requires a health script, it'll automatically add health. I'm going to make this 10 health. And here I'll set the item to be red vine again. And the drop count is 3. So if we want a spawning item, we need to create a new item that can be spawned after we destroy the red vine. I'm going to create a new prefab and a new scriptable object for this. So I'm just going to duplicate red vine, and I'm going to unpack it from prefab. And here I'm going to remove the cuttable interactable object as well as the health script. And I'm just going to add a regular interactable object script. So this item will not be constrained. I'm going to call it red vine cuttings. And I'm going to shrink it to become smaller pieces. Then I'm going to go to scriptable objects. I'm going to go to Flora, and I'm going to create a new scriptable object. So the sprite will be the same as red vine. It'll take up a 1x1 size. It'll be a generic type item, and we'll set the ID to be. In a future episode, I'll create a more concrete way of setting the ID of each item. For now, I'm just going to put them in as they come. So here we can go back to the item and drag in red vine cuttings as its scriptable object, and then add it to prefabs. So here I'm going to reset the position of the prefab, but not the scale. Then if I go back to red vine cuttings, I can set the world prefab. And lastly, before we test, if we go to prefabs, you can go to red vine, and then we can add red vine cuttings as the prefab. Don't forget to tag the red vine cuttings as pickup. so that they can be picked up by the player controller. So I'm just going to pick up this knife and equip it on my hotbar, and then if I hit this plant twice, it'll create vine cuttings which I can then pick up. However, there is a problem with having the red vine having the constraints be completely frozen. So if the player was somehow able to pick up the entire red vine without cutting it, you would end up with a red vine like this, and if you threw it out, it would just float in midair. So I'm going to create a safeguard against this possibility. First, I'm going to go to Scripts, Inventory, and then Interactable Object, and I'm going to open up Interactable Object. Then I'm going to add a new function here. So this function is called freeze movement, and it takes in a bool. So if the bool is true, then we want to freeze all of the rigid body constraints. And if it isn't, we will want to unfreeze all of the rigid body constraints. So this function is to freeze or unfreeze an object. And then if I go back to inventory and open up inventory system, I can go down to the move item function. And here I'm just going to set a temporary game object variable. Then we'll get the interactable object component of the game object and then unfreeze its movement. And that should safeguard us against any accidental items frozen in midair. So here I'm just going to untag the object again. So far in this episode, we have creating the ability to use hotbar items, and as well as the weapon class and the deployable class, and then also cuttable objects. So one more thing I'm going to do for this episode is to create a particle effect to play whenever an object or item takes damage. So first of all, I'm going to create a particle effect. Okay, I've created the particles. So these will play every time that something takes damage. I'm going to call this hurt particle. I'll go to prefabs and I'll create a folder called effects. Then I'm just going to drag in hurt particle to effects. Now I can go to scripts and then I'll create a new folder called effects. And here I'll create a C script called particle pooler. So as I said earlier, the particles will be using object pooling to make sure that we don't have to keep creating and destroying particles, which is very expensive for the CPU. So we're just going to have a particle pooler for every particle we want to be pooled. Yeah, let's make the class. So we'll need a couple of variables. So this is a very simple object pooling script. We're just going to keep a list of the particles, and then whenever we'll have a function that allows other scripts to get a particle to activate it. Yeah, so we needed the variables, the prefab of the particle system we wanted to instantiate, and then a pool size. We are setting a default of 10, and then the list of particles. So yeah, in start, let's initialize this list. Next, I'll create the function getParticle, which returns a particle system from the list of particles that is not currently playing. So we'll check through every particle in the list, and then if it is not playing, we'll return it. And then if there's a case where all of them are playing at once, that means our pool size isn't big enough, we will instantiate another prefab and add it to the list. Now if we go back to Unity, we can create an instance of the particle pooler. I'll go to Game Manager and I'll create an empty game object. Here I'll just add in the particle pooler script and I'll set the particle prefab to be hurt. Next, in order to put this into play, I'm going to go back to health. And here I'm going to add another variable. It's a static variable of the particle pooler. So we'll have a public static variable particle pooler. And then if I go back to particle pooler, I can set the health particle pooler static variable to this. Then if I go down to take damage, here I'm just going to play the particle effect. So I'll retrieve a particle, then I'll set the transform position of the particle. So now if I click play, the particle effect should work now. So I'm just going to pick up the knife again. And when I kill these fish or I kill this plant, it creates the particle effects. So that's all for today's episode. Thank you for watching. If you want to support our channel, you can help us by becoming a patron, because this will give you access to project files for all of our tutorials as well as Patreon exclusive posts on the blog. So any support you give will go a really long way. Right now, we're not making as much money back as we are putting into the content creation. So if you donate, we'll be able to make this a long-term and more sustainable endeavor. See you in the next video.